Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for today's session to help you brush up on the elements of a FSMA-compliant food safety plan. I'm Dana Johnson-Downing, and I'll be the moderator for today's program. Our speakers today are Brian Armentrout and Gary Nowacki. Brian is a food safety consultant with a background working for many of America's best-loved food brands. Gary is the CEO of TraceGains. Now it's time to dig into our topic, so Brian, please go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you, Dana, and thank you to TraceGains for hosting this webinar today. I appreciate it. Today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about FSMA and how to put together a compliant food safety plan. Getting into this, I wanted to kind of briefly go over our agenda so everybody understands what we're looking at today. So our main learning objectives, what is it that we want to get out of this? Why is this entire process important? A little bit about my company and what we do. A brief introduction to quality system theory and how you can apply it to this application. How you can then use that to develop a food safety plan. And we'll be going over in a moderate amount of detail some of the actual templates and plans that I actually use going through this process with my clients. And as a summary and closing piece, as a bonus, that material that we're going over as far as the templates will be available in a Word format if you'd like to download those. So let's dive in. So first thing is learning objectives. We all know on webinars that sometimes it's not always easy to follow what's going on. And the first step with any type of a FSMA compliant plan is the hardest, right? So the vast majority of us have probably gone through PCQI, Preventative Control Qualified Individual Training. I have as well. And once you go through that class and you go back to your production facility, the next question in your mind is what's next? And that's hopefully what I'm trying to help out with this webinar today, is to kind of give you some ideas on what is an effective way of hitting that next step. Now we all know through different announcements that have been made, and I saw today that FDA has let the guidance documents out, some new ones relative to small suppliers, so check those out. Those timelines that are associated with this, and we see lots of different dates that are flying back and forth and extensions relative to foreign supplier and these type of things. But regardless as if you're a large, small, or very small company, it's my position that those timelines are the minimum standard of what it is that you need to meet. Those timelines are pretty much a fallacy, because if you're a small company and you're supplying to a large company, they need to get their programs in order, which means you need to get your programs in order. So if you think you've got some extra time, you may have some, but odds are you probably don't. So as we dive into this session, I'd like to kind of pull everybody back just a little bit here to kind of make note of your intention for this session. There's a very good book by an author named Anise Kavanaugh called Contagious Culture. And in this, whenever she has meetings within her teams, one of the things she teaches is three main areas. So when you're absorbing information like this through a webinar, what's your intention? What is it that you're looking to get out of this today? If you can come out of this with one or two key items or things that you've learned that you didn't know before, that's important. What's your physical state? Are you actually comfortable? Are you sitting in a chair that's got good posture? Do you have a headache? Are there things physically that are going to interfere with how you're receiving this information? Is there anything that you can do about that to make it a little bit better? Sometimes just a little bit of awareness works out just perfectly. Is your mind present? Are you listening to what we're telling you here today, or are you trying to multitask? We all know, and we've seen enough evidence now, that multitasking does not work. When you're multitasking, really what you're doing is switching very fast between multiple things that you're trying to focus on, but you can only focus on one thing at a time. And that takes a lot of mental energy to switch back and forth between those things. So pay attention to what's going on here today. We've all been in webinars where people are typing and they have their mute button off, and we can hear that. Not going to happen here today, but those type of things can be very distracting. If you have things that are more important that you need to focus on, this is going to be recorded, so go back and listen to this at a later time. Then coming out of this, a lot of information is going to be gone over today, but once again, what are those key actions? What are the action steps for me associated with this? So why is this important? We've all been talking about the Food Safety Modernization Act now for quite a while, and there's plenty of webinars out there that go into the actual meat of what is in FSMA, right, in 21 CFR or whatever. Here's what it's actually saying. This webinar is not about that. This is about utilizing now the strategy and tactics you need to do to implement these new programs within your company. And we've all heard the catchphrase from Margaret Hamburger, which was, this has been the most significant change to food safety law in the last 70 years. And it's true, it is. But how are you going to utilize that within your systems? This is the perfect opportunity to really hit that reset button and go back and look at your overall systems and use this to develop awareness within your company. The Park Doctrine, which is a law that's been around for quite a while and a precedent, is now being called up. And what does this actually mean? Right? It means that your C-suite individuals, your CEO, CFO, the individuals within your company who are ultimately responsible for what you're producing, have potential strict liability information that can be tied to them if an issue occurs. We're talking serious Class 1 type issue within their company. So if a 483 is issued to your company, right, the CEO's name is usually the name that's on that 483. That means that he has awareness or she has awareness of an issue within that company. Actions need to be taken to rectify that, or the Department of Justice could come back and take civil action against your company and the individuals within that company. Your senior leadership really needs to understand that. Right? And that's a difficult message to talk up, but it needs to be done. If you are the PCQI, the Preventative Control Qualified Individual within your company, your name is going on the line. You're the individual who is signing off and saying, I certify that this process is producing safe food. There's legal ramifications to that. You need to be aware of that. So if there's only one PCQI in your company, it's my recommendation that you need to have multiple people who are PCQIs. Keep in mind as well that most quality documents, especially from a regulatory standpoint with FDA, have been linked to plan activities. But there's more activities now that are handled in larger companies at the corporate level. So crisis management, procurement, design control within R&D, corporate crisis management, supplier verification. These normally take place at corporate. Now by law, FDA can request this information and you have to have it to your facility within 24 hours. What's the plan and the strategy you're going to put in place to either communicate that information to the plant or have those individuals who are at corporates be available to assist with that as well? Now there's one thing I do know for sure, and I don't know your companies, and there's quite a few people on this line that I do know, but your existing documents will get you into trouble. You need to go back and revise your documentation with the eyes of having FDA looking at it and the potential that that document is in court. Right? So we all have recording forms on the floor that operators fill out where they write down their pounds per man hour and other information along with quality parameters. And on that documentation is usually a section for the operator to make comments. If they're putting comments relative to downtime and other things, which normally happen, maintenance issues and things like that, there could be a potential food safety issue relative to materials that are being held in that line. You need to make sure that those type of things are taken care of within your new food safety plan. So this is the perfect opportunity to go back and revise documentation. Now, it's been my general experience that when you go through this process and you go through what we're going to be talking about relative to quality system theory, you can usually get rid of about 60% of the documentation within your system because it's not relevant to what you're trying to do. So that's why this section is really important. You're telling a story to FDA, right? FDA has only seen a few pages of that story so far. Now, if you're LACF or seafood or juice HACCP, they've seen a lot more. But if you're in a different bucket, the HACCP program you've had in place may or may not have been shared with FDA. Now all that information relative to the food safety plan is laid out on the table. You need to have a clear and concise program that explains to them step by step how you arrived at the decisions you made. And we'll get into that here a little bit later of how to organize that. A couple of quick slides on my business and what my company does. The Food Leadership Group helps develop food systems and quality programs prior to your actual audits, right? So if you are GFSI certified, in this particular example, SQF, if auditors come in and evaluate your systems, they can tell you what's wrong, but they can't consult. They can't tell you how to fix it. So my job in my company is to help you develop the food safety and food certification programs to get you ready for the audits so you have a successful one. So why should you listen to me? Well, I've worked in quality assurance for over 20 years in the QA function. I've served as the Vice President of Quality Assurance for several well-known companies. I've also had the good fortune of serving on the GMA Advisory Committee for Foreign Supplier Verification and was part of the team that presented to FDA with recommendations from the Grocery Manufacturers Association on how the regulations should be written. In addition, I served on the SQF Technical Advisory Council, which is the interdisciplinary group that assists SQFI with the management of the standard. So you have manufacturing, certification bodies, retailers, etc., who are on this board who help make up that team, and I had the honor of being the vice chair of that organization. Listed here on the slides are a variety of companies I've assisted over the years or I'm working with now. So really briefly, one slide is all I've got on this relative to quality system theory. In order to really approach FSMA, you need to look at the hierarchy and what is the actual program that you're trying to implement, right? So what makes for a good system? It sets the rules of the game, and once again, if you're communicating to state agencies who may be auditing on behalf of FDA, if you are sitting in front of an SQF auditor, if you are sitting with customers, you have to have a system in place that explains who you are and what it is that you do. And I use a pyramid to illustrate this hierarchy. So at the top of the pyramid, you have your standard. So in this particular example, we're talking about FSMA. But this could also be OSHA, or it could be SQF, or any other thing that you're choosing to look at. Below that, you have your quality manual. This is the document that bridges the gap between what the standard says and how you do it in your company. So I do this a little differently than most people. I don't look at the quality manual as just a collection of all your documentation. The quality manual is a public document that you can use to help introduce your company and how you meet the different requirements of the standard. So for example, if you look at SQF, if you look at 2.2 document control, what is the overall methodology or systems that you're using, not the actual procedures, but what is the approach that you're using for document control? Below that, then you have policies. So this then bridges back to those statements within your manual and the standard. These are corporate statements that set the rules of the game. So if you're organic or non-GMO or whatever it is, you can use this then to state those requirements relative to the standard. Below that, then you have procedures, work instructions, and recording forms. Now procedures and work instructions are very similar with one key difference. A procedure is something that's interdisciplinary. So if you're in a production facility, if you have something that needs to be agreed upon between multiple managers, so let's say your quality manager and your production manager and your maintenance manager, then that's a procedure, right? That's how that group agrees to do something. So a good example would be GMPs in a plant. A work instruction is somebody who is actually doing something, right? They're doing it, and if something happens and you need to investigate what happened with that process, you can go to an actual individual who performed that task. That's the key differentiation between those two. And of course, then the recording form is the actual proof that you did it, right? So you go at the top from an abstract concept down to the bottom to the concrete proof that you actually did it. And once again, this gets back to that story of how you're explaining these different processes to FDA or anybody else for that matter. This also works in reverse. You can start at the bottom, pick up a recording form, run it back up through the pyramid to find out why you're doing it. If it's no longer relevant to your system, you should think about removing it. This gets back to my earlier comment about 60% of the documentation isn't relevant. So with the storytelling, right, it's plan, do, check, act. And FDA has emphasized this time and time again. What is it? How do you know? How did you measure it? And if it's out of compliance, what did you do about it, right? It's also segmented by purpose. So one of the things, and this is where SQF again comes in very handy, is level 2 and level 3. Level 2 documentation is what FDA is going to be looking at, your food safety plan, the prerequisite programs, preventive controls, these type of things. If you're level 3, that's your food quality systems. Those two should never intermingle. There's no reason for regulators to see level 3. That's only relative to your food quality. Everything needs, of course, to be controlled and documented. And I put a bullet here relative to simple and concise. Hard to do. Right? It's very easy to write very long documents that have lots of information. But the more you write, the more you risk tripping yourself up. And it's always perceived to be better to have your system audited by an accredited standard, right? So if you're looking at SQF or BRC, you have an oversight committee, GFSI, who writes the rules of the game, who audits the auditors, right? That helps to reduce errors within the systems and make sure that things are being calibrated correctly. Now at the bottom here, and once this thing is put out, these links will become live. I've written a book earlier this year relative to quality philosophy and how you can implement these things in your management systems. So if you go to Amazon and hit up that link there. With that title, you should be able to locate that work as well if you want more information on this particular area. So your food safety theory then becomes a subset of the overall hierarchy of what it is that you're trying to do within your food quality programs within your plant and your company, right? So what makes for a good food safety system, right? Thinking back to that pyramid, it identifies your regulatory scope and risk. It's easy to follow and understand, and it's developed out by product category by plant, right? Because we all have multiple SKUs. That's the simplest way to do it. Responsibilities are clear and defined within the document. Issues are addressed and documented, and of course now we have regulatory requirements for the PCQI to follow up on those things. Your preventive and prerequisite programs are separately identified. Your hazard analysis represents information to the source material. And these bullet points we'll get into with the subsequent slides where I'm showing you some of the documentation I use. But the most important point here I want to emphasize is this last bullet point, guys. Understand that this documentation within your food safety plan can and most likely will leave your plant and your control. Now we can mark confidential and proprietary in all this documentation, but mistakes happen, right? You have a clear understanding of what that information is within your systems. FDA may not, right? So under Freedom of Information Act clause, you may be at risk. So always look at that documentation from the standpoint that it could leave your plant. So let's get into the actual food safety plan development. So this is really setting the stage to these bullet points here. What is the information that as you're sitting down with FDA, what is it that they need to know? Now one of the things, I was at SQF last week for their conference, and Gary Smith from Eurofins spoke and went into what is it that FDA is going to be doing relative to auditing your programs, right? So they're going to be coming in, essentially recreating your food safety plan and then comparing notes with you. So the more robust and clear your system is, the better you're going to be in that position, right? So laying out the scope and purpose of your food safety plan. What's your facility profile? How big is it? How old is it? What's it made of? All of these type of things. These are concepts that we're familiar with developing a HACCP plan. So you can take your HACCP plan, tear it down, take out the information relative to it that's going to help you out, and then build up your food safety plan accordingly. Who are your team members? You know, why are they qualified to be on this team? What are the responsibilities within this program, right? Who's the PCQI? Who are the individuals who are reviewing the paperwork? Who's the individual responsible for disposition and maintenance of the system? Who's on corrective action teams? All these type of things. The more detail here, the better. Recommendation, list job titles, not individuals. That way you don't have to go back and change it all the time. What are some key definitions associated with this, right? And this gets into the regulatory definitions. And I have an example here later in here of a very basic system that I use relative to that. What's your finished product profile? What's your pH? What's your water activity? All of these type of things that we're used to with HACCP. What's your intended use, right? Are you selling your product to infant formula? Are you selling your product to immunocompromised people, right? That's a different level and standard that you need to reach relative to your product's food safety. So your prerequisite programs, right? We're all used to these. The key here with your food safety plan is delineating these between your preventive controls and your prerequisite programs. So under prerequisite programs, right, we have things that we're used to. So chemical, biosecurity, intentional adulteration, of course, is coming. Lots more on that is out now. How's your facility designed? How is it protecting food safety, storage, document control? Food safety complaints. Complaints are a good illustration of what I was talking about earlier relative to food safety versus food quality, right? Complaints break down into two buckets. There are people who buy your product and will contact you and say things like, I bought this and I don't like the taste, or I bought this and I had some damage, or I bought this and I was charged too much, right? Quality things that the customer requires you to follow up on to maintain good relations with that customer. Food safety complaints are, I ate your product and it made me ill. Or I ate your product, I'm allergic to peanuts, I think it's got peanuts in it. Right? Those are food safety complaints. When FDA comes to your plant and is reviewing your prerequisite programs and wants to see your complaints, show them your food safety complaints, not your food quality complaints. That's out of scope, right? Back to the pyramid. So your preventive controls, right? Pass, right? So you're looking at your procedures, allergens, sanitation, and supplier controls. So these are the things that have been called out in the legislation that if you have a food safety plan in place where you're controlling issues, right, you still have to go back and do the hazard analysis, but these things need to be addressed. Right? So even if you don't have allergens in your plant, what about your suppliers? All the things that other people have been talking about on webinars. I'm not going to get into that in a whole lot of detail. But the supplier verification is kind of the 800-pound gorilla out of this list, right? Huge. And you really need to look at your company, how you're going to deal with this, once again, at the plant level and at the corporate level. And you need to put together a system of how you determine risk relative to these ingredients in your products, because you can't audit everything. So what documentation are you going to gather for ingredients with low risk, medium, and high? And if you have those high categories, how do you explain that to FDA? And what documentation do you have, and what's the follow-up process associated with those suppliers? So once again, remember that this is an interesting thing with FSMA. Preventive controls that deviate from process as you've defined it need to have corrective actions. So if you have failures within those programs, FDA is going to want to see how you close the loop on that. Prerequisite programs, not mandatory. Right? You can still do them, of course, but they're required under preventive controls. So your hazard analysis, right? Definitely have a risk matrix in place for your decision making so that you can quantify this, right? So I've thrown in here a simple example of low, medium, high that we're used to, right? So this is severity and likelihood, right? So if you're producing a whole lot of it, how's that going to potentially impact it? Create a flow chart by food safety process group, right? Not all of your products, just your different processes within your food safety plan that you're looking at. And as you can see for this example of this flow chart I threw in here, it's pretty basic, right? Remember, this document is potentially public information. Don't put a lot of detail into your food safety plan flow chart in your document that you're showing FDA that could have potentially proprietary information. It needs to be significant enough within the detail where you can identify where your control points are in these type of activities, but my recommendation is don't go into too much detail. Also for your hazard analysis, break it down into ingredient versus process, right? Have two separate sections for your hazard analysis for ingredients and one for process. And we'll go over an example for that here in a bit. So for your actual food safety plan development. So I've got two examples here, and the back one is hidden behind. I apologize about that. So on the top example, you have storage, right? So the example I'm using here is raw milk. And what within the actual process of storing the raw milk is there to help prevent or reduce a food safety hazard? So in this particular example, we know that raw milk inherently has the potential for pathogens and other contamination within it. For the pathogen element, right, we bring in raw milk, we have sanitation programs in place, and we store that milk under controlled, cooled conditions, right, according to the regulations, to help reduce the growth of any potential contaminants within that milk until pasteurization takes place. But that's controlled by a preventative step further down the line. The example underneath is a raw material, so let's say peanut butter, right? And if, let's say you're making a granola bar. You don't have any controls in your plant that are going to prevent a potential contaminant, let's say salmonella in the peanut butter. So you're relying upon your supplier approval program, COA review, supplier auditing. You may do periodic raw material testing, these type of elements to help control that risk. That's the point in time where that's actually being controlled. So that is a preventive control at that step. So verification and validation. Once again, the parallels back to your HACCP program. But once again, this is not HACCP, right? Just don't take your HACCP program and put a different title on it. It needs to be gone through separately. Examples of definition here. You don't need to have a fancy definition, but a working one always helps, right? And this helps with the team on the floor. So one I've always worked with are these two. So verification, right? Are the activities being done? That in the pyramid is that recording form that's being checked off, that those parameters you've identified for a food safety hazard are being checked, right? And then the PCQI is verifying those activities and making sure that everything is going smoothly. Validation is, are the right things being measured? So back to the dairy example, let's say that we set up a time and temperature on the pasteurizer that are too short or too cold. But the operator's checking those, and according to him, those are all within standard. Later on, the verification activity shows that based upon the viscosity for that particular product, that's too low, right? So you were checking everything like you should, but the actual standard themselves were wrong. So the validation schedule. So how are you looking at things? So once again, the parallel back to HACCP, right? So changes in the system, you're required by law now to have a periodic review of your program. So those type of activities associated with verification. Then your reanalysis checklist. So when something does change, what were the different things that you as a team looked at for the food safety plan to make sure that things are correct, right? So this is something that FDA is going to be looking for as they go back and look for your periodic review of your food safety plan. And of course, resources. And my recommendation here is always use resources, if you can, that the government themselves have provided, right? So in this example here, so we have the FDA Bad Bug Book, which is a fantastic reference for FDA's concerns relative to particular products, outbreaks relative to when that document was released, and what type of organisms may be involved in those type of issues. Of course, your book that you received when you got your PCQI training is a fantastic resource, tons of information there. So definitely look at that. A Food Defense Plan Builder. If you haven't used this for your biosecurity program, FDA has a free Food Defense Plan Builder that's available for download. Other references. There's some other good ones for CDC relative to RFR, the Reportable Food Registry, and what have been the reported incidences through the last 5 years relative to particular product categories. So you can use that information then to justify what it is that you're looking at for risk relative to your product. So kind of swinging this back around. So the good news, right, you have a good base in place already. Right? So this is just FDA, and the phrase that's been used is FDA blew up HACCP, right? So they've reorganized everything and changed it around. But you've got a good base already relative to this. Use that, and then use that to build out your system. Get PCQI certified, Preventive Control Qualified Individual. Now under the law, you can use experience to justify to FDA that you have the relevant experience and you don't necessarily have to be certified. My recommendation is still to get certified. It's much better to have that on the wall and hanging there, essentially sanctioning what you're saying, versus having to retroactively prove that if something does happen. Right? Because if you have a recall going on, that may be strong evidence that you may not have the necessary experience for managing a food safety plan. So it's much better to cut off that potential avenue and have that certificate hanging on the wall. Follow a hierarchy within your documentation system. Why are you doing things? Right? Quality systems build up over the years. People come and go, they create new systems, or an issue happens with a customer and documentation that gets put into the system. Now's the time to go back and relook at all that type of stuff. Right? But this doesn't have to be hard. This can be easy if you follow a system and you systematically go through and manage this, right? We all know that if you tackle 5 problems at once and you do a little bit on each, none of them ever get done. Focus in, do one thing at a time. Create your food safety plan first. This is then going to give you your action plan relative to what else you need to do to get ready for FDA and have everything good to go. Figure out how is it that you're going to explain your story to FDA. When they sit down with you in the conference room and you have an investigator, right? They're investigators now, not inspectors. When they're sitting there, how are you going to explain what it is that you do and why you produce safe food? The clearer you are in telling that story, the easier it's going to be for your audits. Close the loop on your preventive controls, right? Always close the loops. FDA doesn't expect perfection, and they've been talking about this in their public meetings quite a bit. If you're doing environmental testing, and you're testing drains and floors and whatever, zone 3, zone 4, and you're not finding hits, you're not looking hard enough. Right? If anything, that's going to work against you. So you need to have those systems in place to show that you have corrective action capability. Now, where do I think FDA is going to focus moving forward? Right? We're all learning what the hell's going on here as a group. That includes FDA. And they've done a great job of working with industry to both come together to come up with a new system. FDA is going to focus, once this thing becomes implemented and is active, on problem areas, right? So if there's a massive recall going on in an area and they haven't focused on that before, guess what? They're going to focus on that. There's also traditional products that they know that problems exist. They're going to focus on those. Make sure that you're ready for that if you're in those particular categories. Stay up to date on the changes, right? There's a lot of moving stuff going on right now. Go to FDA's website, sign up for their email notice lists. Keep up to date. There's some great resources out there with GMA and other things where you can get this information. Stay up to date. Don't be that example if something does happen in your industry. Be ready. and ask for help, right? So part of the thing with quality is we think we're in a vacuum, but there's tons of people out there who can help with this and want to make sure, because food safety is not a point of competition. If one ice cream manufacturer has an issue, they all have issues, right? So ask for help. Bonus material. So the actual documentation that you guys saw through this presentation, I'm giving away. So these are the actual templates that I use when I go into food manufacturing locations to help them put together their food safety plans. To get access to that, here's how you do this. On your phone, text to the number 44222, and in the message, put FSMA tool, FSMA tool, not case sensitive, all together, and send a message. You should get a reply back, and then you can put in your email, and I'll send you the Word document, so fully editable for those forms that I shared with you here today. If for whatever reason that doesn't work, fire me off an email and I'll get it to you directly. Sometimes I've found that IT departments may block that functionality within your company, so I'll get it to you directly. Once these links become live, recently I did an interview with Dr. Robert Brackett of the Illinois Institute of Technology, one of the key architects between the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance and the documentation that we went through. It's about a 15-minute conversation where we went through some of the key learnings and things that are going on with that, so that's definitely a big resource. In addition, some other links relative to how you can get a hold of me will become active. And if you'd like to talk offline and get additional information, happy to. Just book a free 30-minute consultation with me and we'll see if I can help you out. And now I guess we're going to switch over to Gary.
All right, thank you, Brian, very much. Just a reminder to the audience, please type in any questions you have in the chat box. We've had a lot of great questions already. We will answer as many of those as we can get to. So I'll be brief, very briefly on TraceGains. We offer different products. They are all completely modular. You can use any one of these products in a standalone environment. You don't have to worry about integrating them to your ERP system like SAP. And they're all cloud-based for quick deployment. So going left to right, supplier management addresses a lot of the issues Brian was talking about, which is correctly evaluating your suppliers and profiling them for risk. So if you don't have all of the documents from your suppliers, whether it's allergen or insurance or product guarantees or what have you, TraceGains can help you very quickly collect those through our network of thousands of suppliers. Supplier compliance allows you to do lot-by-lot compliance, as Brian mentioned. Again, risk related to incoming lots, looking at things like certificates of analysis and automatically letting you know when something is out of range against your specifications or your quality or your safety measurements. Specifications publishing helps you communicate with your suppliers to further refine your specs if that's something you need to do. And then within your four walls, quality management helps you monitor all of the critical control points related to your food safety plan so that you have all of these electronic records for sanitation and all the different things that you need to do. Across all these products, the philosophy is a simple one. What we want to do is empower people to get rid of paper documents and 3-ring binders and filing cabinets, turn this all into digital records so the data is instantly available in the case of an audit, which may be unannounced, which is becoming more and more frequent. And automatically there are alerts given to you anytime a critical control point is not done, a supplier violates one of your business rules, and so on and so forth. When you do report electronic records through quality management, TraceGains module within your four walls, it's done very intuitively and easily on tablet-type devices so that little to no training is required of your hourly workers or supervisors using this record collection capability. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our MC, Dana, who will open it up for questions.
Great, thanks, Gary. We do have a number of questions coming in, and if you tried to text to get the FSMA tool from Brian, you do text to 44222, and then in the body of the message write FSMA tool. And if you have any technical difficulties from that, you can just email Brian. Oh wait, we have the wrong slide. It doesn't have Brian's contact information, it has someone else's. Well, that's unfortunate. We'll include Brian's contact information in the email that we send out with the copy of the slides and a recording of this webinar. So our first question is a pretty simple one, but it's an important one. Someone asked, what is a PCQI?
PCQI, so underneath the Food Safety Modernization Act regulation, it's a requirement that in each facility there's a responsible individual for the food safety plan. That's the preventive controls qualified individual. So as part of the regulations, FDA requires one of two things in order to meet that criteria. You can either show FDA relevant experience. So, hey, I've been working in the dairy industry for 20 years as a quality manager. I've had HACCP training. I've put together HACCP programs, et cetera, et cetera. I'm qualified to manage this program. The other option is a 2.5-day course, and this is done all over the country. Just do a search for this, and you'll probably find somebody close by who does the training. It's a standardized curricula that was created through the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance based upon information they've learned from preventive control alliances with seafood HACCP, and they've created a criteria for training to become a PCQI qualified individual. And at the end of the class, you take a test, and if you pass the test, you're certified. So when FDA shows up at the plant and says, we want to talk to the preventive controls qualified individual and look at your food safety plan, that's the person who gets the call.
Great. And we did have a number of questions from folks wanting to know if we recommend someone in particular for PCQI training. And I will tell you that here at TraceGains, we contracted with a local food safety expert in the Denver area by the name of Nancy Charlock. Her company is called Soterian Systems, and so you can find her at www.soteriansystems.com. She's also spoken at our TraceGains Users Conference. We highly recommend her. She does a lot of training in the Denver area. There's another one of our marketing partners that does training in Canada. Her name is Sonia Akbashadeh. And there are a lot of trade associations, such as the grocery manufacturers. I think the American Frozen Food Institute does training. Brian, do you want to share where you took your PCQI course?
Yeah, so what I did with mine is I doubled up with the conference I was at. So I went to IFT, and they had training there. So at the SQF conference last week, they had a day before the conference where they did training as well.
And I believe the Food Safety Consortium, which is in the Chicagoland area in December, I believe they're also having PCQI courses as well. So you might want to look and see if there are any organizations that your company is a member of. That would be a good source. Or, of course, Soterian Systems is a good option if you're in the western United States. The next question that we want to go to is, what do we need to be aware of when sending unusable food products to animal food? Is that something you can address?
What is it again?
When they have food waste that they want to move into animal food for feed, are there special considerations that they need to take? That's a different rule.
Yeah, that's a big question. That's maybe I can
we can take that one offline and get that answer to you. So this person asks, are magnets and screens utilized in a rendering plant preventive controls or SOPs?
So a preventive control is, so the acronym is PASS, right? So processes, allergens, sanitation, and suppliers, right? So you could put that under process or sanitation as well, right? So it's all relative to your food safety plan, right? So if you're relying upon that particular step to remove a potential injurious situation, I mean, that could be part of your preventive controls, yeah. Now, if it's something that's in the process with a subsequent step downstream where you have additional controls in place, you know, screens, whatever, it could be part of your prerequisite programs.
So we have some more PCQI questions. This person asks, does the PCQI need to be SQF trained?
No, you do not. Although it's definitely helpful, you do not.
This next person asks if they can lose their FDA certification if there's a non-compliance with FSMA.
So potentially, yes, right? So we all have facility registration numbers right now. So if FDA is performing an inspection at your facility and finds an issue that could potentially be injurious to human health or animal, whatever rule they're talking about, they can halt production given the right mechanisms. So yeah, they can.
I did put Brian's contact information back on the screen and the information about how to get his FSMA tool. And if you're not able to get it through the text function, please just email him at that address that's on the screen. And now we'll go back to questions. Bear with me. Does the Park Doctrine require knowledge of the wrongdoing to move forward with a prosecution, or can one be prosecuted even without knowledge of the issue?
Yeah, so I actually had a conversation last week with a food safety lawyer about this, right? So in the example I gave during my presentation, notification was given by FDA, right? So FDA comes in to your facility, finds a potential issue, cites a 483, sends it to the CEO, right? So in that scenario, the CEO is aware of that situation. That needs to be taken care of, right? It's not an acceptable defense for the CEO to say, well, I got operations people and they deal with that and I just assumed that they took care of it. That doesn't work. Now, the issue of something was going on, nobody was aware of it, can they be held on that? Now you're getting into a gray area. I asked that exact same question and the response back was probably not, but we're talking law and compliance. So it's all going to depend upon the particulars of that situation. That's definitely a topic I want to learn more about because this is an evolving subject of how the Park Doctrine, because this is an old rule, how this is now being applied and what the Department of Justice is doing relative to this when an issue relative to human health is coming up, right? So we've seen investigations that have been launched by DOJ relative to Bluebell ice cream and Chipotle. So the mechanisms that FDA is starting to employ for these type of issues.
Brian, could you please repeat why you think it's recommended for some plants to have more than one PCQI?
Right. It's always better to have one, I mean, just from a simple logistical situation, right? There are time requirements for that documentation review and when the PCQI needs to sign off on that. Now, the PCQI can delegate with proper training within the organization sign-offs, which they then review. But if that PCQI is on vacation, how does that happen, right? So it's the recommendation that I'm giving to my clients is that you should have more than one. In addition, that helps to raise awareness within the organization of the Food Safety Modernization Act, and going back to the beginning of my presentation, how this is a game changer for how you need to be doing things within your organization. I know companies that are sending all of their management team to PCQI training. Now, if you've got a ton of people in your company, you can arrange to have those trainers come to you. But the more people that understand this and the more people that understand that they have responsibility and they have legal implications when they sign up on the line, the better.
That's a good point. And we did a similar thing here at TraceGains. We had Nancy Charlotte come in and do an in-house training at in our conference room. And I know she's done the same thing for some of our customers. So if you're not in the Denver area, Nancy could certainly come to you, or you could go through the other trade associations and organizations we mentioned earlier. So the next person asks, are you going to send us the slides? And the answer is yes. We always send out a follow-up email following our webinars with a link to the recording and a place where you can download a PDF of the slides. So you'll look for that email either later today or tomorrow. Can a procedure, such as an SOP, and a work instruction be interchangeable?
Yeah, so if there's people on the line that know me, they're probably laughing right now. No. So I like to simplify as much as possible. I've never found a reason beyond policy procedure, work instruction, and recording form to have subcategorizations of different types of documents, right? An SOP that deals with a person performing a task is a work instruction. An SOP that deals with multiple individuals and responsibilities is a procedure.
So if I'm an importer of alcoholic beverages, specifically wine under 7%, which falls into the FDA food category, can the supplier be the party responsible for a food safety plan, not the importer? And does the supplier go through a slightly different or smaller food safety process since it's wine?
Well, I'm going to, for this question, I'm going to take it up to a higher level and just look at overall, because I've seen a couple of questions here that are relative to this, right? foreign supplier verification, who's doing what, right? So if you're the person buying stuff, it's your responsibility to make sure that you evaluate that stuff and that it's not going to produce a food safety risk. And documenting that and showing proof to FDA that you've done your due diligence relative to that. If you are an importer, it's your job to supply that documentation so that they can make that judgment, right? Now, then you get into the complications of going through brokers and secondary information. But the bottom line is, regardless of the product, you have to have that information available and doing that risk assessment back to that document matrix, right? So I've received the question before from foreign suppliers, what's my responsibility to get FSMA certified? You don't have a responsibility in that particular instance. What you have is the responsibility to provide that food safety information so that they can make the correct evaluation on the other end. So this is going to be a huge area, which is why I put this in red in the presentation, right? There's going to be a ton of back and forth and a whole lot of confusion relative to this, right? So the better your system's in place, the better off you're going to be for managing this and explaining this to FDA, right?
The next person says, we are a wet processing operation of frozen berries. Inherently, there is no kill step in our process. Any thoughts on a preventive control for this type of operation?
Well, one of the things that FDA has evaluated and put into the regs, right, is if you have hazards within your process that aren't controlled, you have to notify downstream customers that you have a risk and it's their responsibility to control that. This is known as the written assurance clause. And there's been a bunch of back and forth, and this has been pushed out, right, because there's going to be some complications relative to this. So let's use an example, let's say nuts, right? So you're selling raw nuts, which nobody's really doing it anymore, but let's say you are. And you're selling it into a company and saying, hey guys, those raw nuts that we're selling you, we're not controlling the hazard for salmonella. It's your responsibility to control that hazard. We've identified it, and we're passing the responsibility to you if you buy our product. You then are required to control that risk. And if you don't, you become liable, right? So if you've identified risks within your process, right, if you're looking at blueberries or whatever, they need to be controlled. So how do you do that? Or what do downstream people relative to this product do to control that risk, right? So chlorine or whatever relative to these particular materials. Then how is that verified? And how do you validate it within your food safety plan? And what documentation do you have to back up your decision?
Next question is, for a very basic low-risk operation, can the food safety plan be combined with a HACCP plan?
Well, my recommendation is why have two, right? Simple and concise. Obsolete your HACCP plan, create a food safety plan, right? So if you have a nice simple operation, that's great. It's going to make for an easier process, but transition your HACCP plan to the food safety plan.
Next person says, I don't really see a difference between the HACCP processes and all these examples that you showed.
Yeah, it's pretty close, isn't it? So in a lot of issues, FDA use some of the forms that are out there already, right? So if you're in the dairy industry, there's some forms that have been used for HACCP for quite a while relative to NCIMS, right? So Interstate Milk Shippers Organization. And some of those were adopted. Now, don't let that fool you, right? So there are definite requirements here relative to PCQI and when you're required by law to reevaluate your systems and things of this nature, right? So the similarities are there, but as I kind of cautioned early on in this presentation is don't think they're the same and that FDA is going to accept that. When they come into the plant and if they say, I want to see your food safety plan, and you say, well, my HACCP plan looked pretty much the same, so I just left it all alone, you're not going to be happy with their response.
The next person asks, Brian, do you have any recommendations for where to look to assure that all hazards and preventive controls have been identified for a tamale manufacturer with pork, beef, and vegetable tamales?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, so the first place, so USDA products, right? So what's interesting with this is there's going to be overlap, right? So this is other questions that come up as well. Okay, what's going to happen over time? Is USDA programs going to roll in with FDA programs and these type of things? My guess is probably not, right? You have different, and so Bob Garfield, the SVP of SQF, there's a bunch of acronyms for you, has talked about this at length, right? And you have different power structures within the government that oversee those different groups. And so the chances of these guys coming together are pretty slim, right? So if you have a facility where you have USDA processes and FDA processes, keep your USDA stuff the same, right? And then build out your food safety plans for everything else. Will these things merge together? Potentially. I mean, these two agencies are going to have to figure out how they manage these things. This is my opinion on what's going to happen over time. But really what I think is going to happen with FSMA relative to how this is overseen is FDA is going to migrate more toward medical device, right? They have a lot of experience in that area of how to control and validate processes within that area. And this FSMA law follows that relatively closely, right? So over time, it's going to move in that direction. And FDA is going to develop standardized templates based upon particular product categories, which may or may not fall over into FDA/USDA regulatory roles. So there's going to be some gray area in that. So strategically look at your systems relative to USDA, FDA. Now for tamales and things like this, look at sub-ingredients, right? So different sources out there through CIFSAN, CDC reporting, other websites, USDA, et cetera, where you can go and look at the risk profiles for those particular subcategories.
Someone just asked, isn't Part C the same as the food safety plan?
Yeah, so Part C's kind of gone away, right? So just my short and curt answer on that is just get rid of that. I mean, it's kind of like preventative controls and preventive controls, right? So we're all kind of being retrained on language and terminology that we're using, right? So preventive controls in your food safety plan. So I just dropped the Part C.
And that's what FDA is saying too. They want people to sort of eliminate that from their lexicon,
yeah.
Just like they wanted us to all stop saying preventative. Next question is, I'm including environmental sampling and in-house testing for Listeria species. Should I test Zone 1 surfaces in my plant?
I have no idea. I mean, from the context of this question, I can't answer that. Maybe what we can do is we can talk offline and I can provide some additional insight.
Great. The next person says, can you go over the differentiation of a prerequisite and a preventive program?
Yeah, so prerequisites are those things that are identified in the law that if you've identified in your food safety plan hazards that need controlling that have to be addressed, right? So that's an acronym, again, PASS, P-A-S-S. Process, allergen, suppliers, and sanitation, right? Those are required. Those are preventive controls that requires strict mechanisms of how you're monitoring those, right? What is it that's in place? Those are the tier 1 things that you're worried about in your plan, right? Analogous to a CCP, my recommendation on that is you can call them a combination of CCP, preventive control, whatever you want, but why bother? Just call them preventive controls, right? So those are the things as you're going through that checklist that you're identifying where it would used to have said CCP, it now says, is this a preventive control that requires a control of this step? Yes or no? Right? So your prerequisites then, just like in your HACCP analogy, those are the things that support those programs, right? So facility design, employee training, GMPs, all of that type of stuff.
Gary, this is a question for you from the audience. What does TraceGains consider mandatory regulatory documentation in its system?
We've got dozens of documents that the system is set up to automatically collect from suppliers, and but whether any of those are required in your environment, I'm not sure the FDA is prescriptive on that. There are, third-party audit, for example, would be a very common document that just about anybody would want to have on hand. But if you directly audit that suppliers yourself, I don't know. Likewise, allergens, very, very common document required for a lot of items from a lot of suppliers, but there may be exceptions to that as well. So, Brian, do you want to chime in with any additional wisdom in this area?
No, I mean, that makes sense. And I mean, so just one additional comment on the allergen piece, right? I mean, so as we've all sent out allergen forms to our suppliers over the years, right? Do you have allergens in your plant? Are you making these products on lines that contain other allergens, right? Those multiple questions that we have. If those customers are checking off on those boxes that yes, we have other allergens in our plant, FDA is going to expect that you follow up on that and find out what programs are in place at that supplier to mitigate that risk.
Great. Next up, we have customers expect detailed flow diagrams. Do we keep two different food safety plans, one for customers and one for the FDA?
Well, I mean, part of this is an evolving understanding of how this is all going to work, right? So once again, Wanda, back to my original comment, essentially your food safety plan is becoming a public document, right? You don't want information in there that's proprietary, and that then becomes, once again, a conversation with those customers so that they understand it. They're going to be going through the same stuff too, right? So from my viewpoint, the age of having super detailed flow diagrams that list every pump and sensor and everything else, that goes away. Now that information will still be tracked in other systems through the engineering group and stuff like that, but it's my recommendation not to put that in your food safety plan.
Next question is, do you consult and look at existing quality systems and help fill gaps to be compliant with the FSMA program?
Short answer, yes. So that's what my company does, is so go in, perform a gap assessment to a particular standard, right back to that pyramid. You then look at that, create an action plan relative to those gaps that are still missing, and then we can take next steps according to that.
I did just want to recognize that we are at the top of the hour, and Brian has agreed to hang on with us for another 10 minutes or so. I don't know that we'll be able to get all of your questions, but a lot of the questions are similar in nature, so hopefully we'll be able to kind of group them together and get you the answers that you need.
Yeah, these are great questions.
The next question is, rendering temperatures of products considered completely cooked and a kill step of cooked products is 165 degrees. Always exceeding that cook temp, would this need to be a CCP?
Based upon the information there, yes, right? So if you have a process that has time and temperatures that are required for the control of pathogens within that process, yeah, you need to show that you're above those limits. So I'll go back to what I'm most familiar with, right, which is dairy. So time and temperature on a pasteurizer, right? So if you're running a pasteurizer at 165 for 15 seconds, you never come close to that, right? You're running at 170 or whatever. So if you have any variations within your process, you're never going to be below that critical limit. If you didn't have that within your system, FDA or USDA or whoever is a particular example are going to be asking you a lot of questions. So yeah, it needs to be there.
The next question that we have isn't a full sentence, so I'm going to just ask Gary to explain the lot-by-lot tracking in TraceGains.
So the second product that I talked about we call supplier compliance, and what that does is it focuses on your inbound lots coming in from suppliers. We're assuming you've already got all the various documentation on file from your suppliers, like allergens and audits and country of origin and that kind of stuff, and that now you may have risk associated with inbound lots from a non-conformance standpoint. And maybe it's not a safety risk, maybe it's a quality risk that you have where, to use an example, maybe flour coming in has the wrong moisture level, and it's going to give you problems when you're in your bake-out cycle on the plant floor. So what we do is we take the certificates of analysis that have been sent in, hopefully in advance from the suppliers. Our customers now encourage that. So we take those certificates of analysis and we digitally scan them and break them down, extract all the data off of there, and alert you that, hey, here's a batch of flour that is going to show up in your receiving dock tomorrow. The supplier has said that the moisture level is out of spec. And then we do additional lot-by-lot stuff, such as you're recording any problems that were spotted on the receiving dock, recording any problems where maybe you open the container when it's out on the plant floor and you find foreign material or what have you. So hopefully that answers the question, but the listener can also go to our website and look at more details or simply reach out to us for a quick demonstration.
Thanks, Gary. Did you have something you wanted to add, Brian?
Quick comment on that is this is where telling your story becomes really important, right? So don't lock yourself into standards that are going to cause you all kinds of grief, because normally what happens in a plant is if there's a variation to a specification that's not food safety critical, right, that QA or someone can look at that and make a decision whether or not that's acceptable, right? So as you write your different documentation, make sure you take that into account. here's our specification, here's our standard ranges, here's the acceptable limits. If it happens to fall outside of this, we have a process where we can then evaluate and determine if it is acceptable or not, right? So you can tell your story to FDA relative to how you manage that. If you lock everything down so tight where you have to reject it, you're just going to cause yourself a lot of grief.
Would FDA audit the facility every year? Would it be an announced or an unannounced audit?
Well, FDA is always unannounced, right? They're never going to tell you when they're showing up. And when they show up is going to be dependent upon what we talked about earlier, which is, are you producing a risky product? Are you producing something that FDA is concerned about that's in the news a lot? Or even it could be something as simple as you're located in a city that has an FDA district office and they like to come into your facility and bring new inspectors or investigators in to train them, right? So you may see FDA more than other locations. Also remember, states such as Texas have agreements with FDA to contract out those audits to the state agency, right? So they're acting on behalf of FDA. So all those different things can apply. Now FDA is under extreme pressure with the way the law was written to perform a certain number of audits, and they don't have the resources to do that. So we'll see how all this plays out.
So I know you already talked about USDA facilities. We've got another question about dual jurisdiction plants where FSIS and FDA are overseeing a plant. So do you have any thoughts on whether a USDA HACCP plan can be incorporated into the food safety plan to coexist, or should they have separate plans?
My recommendation early on is keep them separate. Right? So as time goes on, they're going to integrate, and there's going to be some cross-pollination of USDA inspectors looking at food safety plans and vice versa, but not in the beginning. So create your food safety plan for those elements that fall under FDA and keep your USDA HACCP plan for those elements.
How are prerequisite control programs identified in the actual hazard analysis? Do they need to be identified or just preventive controls?
So the hazard analysis, as you're going through the process, right, so you identify within your process what are your preventive controls, what are your prerequisite programs that you're using, right? So you're going to make sure that those programs are effective, right? So if you say that a GMP program is a prerequisite, well, FDA is going to be they're going to want to see your training records. How do you know that, right? Everybody in the plant, this is another key difference between FSMA and HACCP, right? Everybody who has a role in the food safety plan has to be trained, right? So what are they trained in? All these type of activities. How are you going to document all that information? If you identify in your hazard analysis risks that could either be from preventive or prerequisite programs that may acquire additional controls, you may want to list them in there. Once again, you're telling your story, right? You're walking FDA through it. And it may be that you identify a prerequisite program in there and you say, well, no, this isn't something that's requiring a preventive control because of this and this and this, right? So you're going to reference those things in there. So if you have a hazard, you always need to address those preventive controls in your program, so allergens and those type of things. FDA is going to be looking for that closely. And once again, what's the leading cause of recalls? Allergens, right? Mislabeling and other issues. So FDA is going to be really zoned in on that type of stuff. Yeah, just tell your story through it. It doesn't need to be perfect, right? So for ingredients, here's what we looked at. For process, here's what we looked at. And here's the preventive and prerequisite control programs we utilize.
Next person isn't a fan of the FDA template from their PCQI training. They're wondering if they can simply write down a risk assessment to document their risk assessment and an overview of all their food safety steps.
The form, and this is emphasized in the PCQI training, the forms that are provided in that training are recommendations. You can do whatever you want. Now, keep in mind there's a pragmatic element to this as well. You are going to be explaining to an FDA investigator who may or may not have been in your plant before and has never seen this information before, your systems. And the more familiar the format is, the easier it's going to be for FDA to follow along. So if you create a whole new form and a whole new system, they've got to start from square one.
And I think it's important to realize that these new documents are new for industry, and they're also new for the FDA inspectors. Just as we've all been taking PCQI and other training this summer to be ready for FSMA, the FDA inspectors have been receiving training just as we have. So the more that you can make it a familiar document or format, I think the better off you'll be. The next question is, how should EMA be evaluated for ingredients? And of course, by EMA, they mean economically motivated adulteration.
So I saw a fantastic presentation at the SQF conference on this, and so through who was that? They do like
Rod Wheeler. Was it Rod Wheeler?
Yeah, no, it wasn't Rod Wheeler. So there's systems out there, and if you email on me this, I can pull it up because I want to talk with this guy. Relative to intentional adulteration and what type of sources you can use to identify what are items that you should be considering. And one of the key points that was an aha moment for me during his presentation was price changes. So in his presentation, he had listed a couple of raw materials, and there's been a huge spike recently in garlic. The pricing of garlic has like doubled or tripled. Now, if you're a not above board supplier of garlic and you see that pricing go up, right, you may want to cash in on those profits. So that may be something in your company that you need to take an additional look at. His presentation closely modeled risk assessment, and there's a tool that he has that was pretty good for looking at all these different elements. I think they identified 8 or 9 different elements relative to this. Now, on the intentional adulteration, we got a little bit more time on this, but we need to start thinking about it, so it's good that you're asking the question.
I realize we're not going to get through all of our questions, but we are going to hang on and answer probably 2 more. This person says the EU standards require packaging migration studies. Does FSMA require this as well? And he says we currently require non-BPA policies from suppliers.
Yes. So BPA, right? So there's been a lot going on with this, with cam linings and such in California and Prop 65, right? So you have cross-pollination of different things that are going on here as well. Mitigation studies in Europe are huge, right? They've had issues in the past there, and there's one in particular I can think of where there was some ink that was used on a label that went on top of brie, where the ink wasn't food grade and got into the rind of the brie. So issues like that tend to bring these things up to the forefront. Your primary contact packaging in your food safety plan, you need to look at that, right? That's an ingredient. Anything that's touching your product, you need to have documentation in place. Is that food grade? Did you evaluate that supplier? Who's it coming from? How do you know that that's safe, right? So generally that level should be acceptable. Migration studies and such, and it's kind of expecting my medical device piece earlier, not at this point, right, unless there's something that's very risky, but I don't, based upon what we're talking about here, see that.
So this gentleman says his PCQI trainer recommended professional liability insurance. Would you agree that this is a sensible precaution, or is it unnecessary?
Wow, that's interesting. My wife's a pharmacist and she has insurance.
When I worked at USDA, I definitely had professional liability insurance.
That's a very astute observation. There's legal ramifications here, and that may be something to look at. That's a very good idea.
The next question is, what are the real differences between a HACCP team and a PCQI team?
Oh, that's a big question. The short answer, suitable for a webinar, is none, right? So FDA comes in, right? Here's my team. Here's individuals who are on my team. Here's why they're qualified to be on this team. Here's how often we meet. Here's the training I gave them relative to this, or they all went to PCQI training, which would be awesome. But who are those members of the team making that decision, right? So just like with your HACCP plan, when you're auditing those, what you're looking for an interdisciplinary team that are looking at all different aspects in your plant, right? So maintenance and quality and operations and sanitation, and all these guys have a play in it. So they should be very similar.
And the last question I think that we'll be able to take is, I think this is from a former coworker of yours, Brian. He asked, do you have a food quality template, and is it similar to your food safety template?
Yeah, I do have templates that I use for food quality. So as I've developed level 3 systems over the years, I've developed different methodologies for doing that. So yeah. If you'd like me to dig up an example of what I've done and get over to you, just fire me an email.
Great, and I think that's going to have to do it for our questions today. I do want to thank our audience for tuning in and hanging with us through this Q&A. I know I've learned a lot from Brian's presentation, and I hope you did too.